Hi, everyone. I'm Stan Mallow, the paranormal yacker. My guest on today's show is Ken Goudsward. I'll be speaking with him about his book, Fermi's Paradox is BS, the evidence for extraterrestrial life. Ken is a system analyst with expertise in industrial robotics, software engineering, and data design. He enjoys applying these skills to ancient Hebrew and Sumerian documents and the UFO phenomenon. Ken Goudsward, welcome to Paranormal Yacker.
Thanks, Stan. It's great to be back.
The title of your book, Ken, is, as stated in my introduction, Fermi's Paradox is BS. There is no doubt in my mind I'd be correct if I said that just about everyone in my viewing audience knows what BS is. However, not as many might know what Fermi's Paradox is. That being the case, could you tell me what it is?
Fermi's paradox is sort of a funny thing because it's not really a paradox and it's not really proposed by Fermi. But somebody tried to give him the credit, and I think someone was trying to make their idea look like it was coming from a very famous physicist. Essentially, Fermi refers to Enrico Fermi, and he was one of the leading physicists at the time in the 1940s and was involved in the development of the United States' nuclear program during World War II. He's a smart guy. He's got good credentials and a great background check. It makes sense that one would want to affiliate with such a guy. But the problem is the linkage between Fermi himself and the so-called Fermi paradox is weak and tenuous at best. Essentially, it goes something like this. In the late 40s, everyone was getting interested in the UFO phenomenon. Of course, the Roswell incident had just happened in 1947 and a couple of other big ones. And there was a lot of press in the papers and in the radio and TV about flying saucers. A lot of the talk at that time was around Martians. There were other kinds of speculation as to where these UFOs may be coming from. And then people began to explore the idea kind of scientifically and mathematically about, well, where could they be coming from? And scientists began to look at what are now called exoplanets, which is planets that would possibly be capable of producing or sustaining life that are outside of our known places that we haven't yet really explored or know too much about. They were looking at, of course, our neighboring planets such as Venus and Mars and even Jupiter and Saturn, as are these possibly places where alien life could be found, and maybe they're the source of where the UFOs are coming from. Other more theoretical physicists began to tackle the question with sort of a more mathematical viewpoint in terms of, well, we know that there are billions of stars. In fact, there are billions of galaxies in the universe. Each one of those galaxies contains billions of stars. From a statistical standpoint, a model was developed which later became known as the Drake equation, and essentially says that if you plug in kind of these numbers in terms of variables, like how many planets there would be in a solar system, how many planets per galaxy, I guess, how many galaxies might the universe hold, and then what kind of percentages or probabilities that any one of those planets might contain the necessary elements for life. And so we're talking about air and water and sunlight and the right amount of heat and that kind of thing. Then it kind of filtered out in through the culture in the scientific community. Actually, the probability is like extremely high, bordering on like definite, like basically there has to be life out there somewhere. Then supposedly, this is where the paradox comes in, is that supposedly Fermi and his buddies were talking about the Drake equation per se, although we don't know if they actually did talk about that. The one little bit of fact that we do have regarding Fermi is he said something to the effect of, and this is not verbatim, about something to the effect of, okay, well, if that's true, where is everybody? That was a great little soundbite. And so where is everybody kind of turned into this quote from Fermi. Who knows if he actually said it or if he said something very similar or maybe not quite as similar, but it's a great quote. The idea is, mathematically speaking, there has to be life out there, yet we haven't found them, so that's a paradox. But one of the reasons that this is BS, in my opinion, is that we have found them. To simply state something so bold a claim to say that we have not found them is an extremely misleading statement, and that kind of lies at the crux of whether this is paradoxical or not, and really what's really going on. Ultimately, the real question is there any life in the universe at all? And this whole paradox thing is kind of misdirection in a way and sort of kicking dust into the air to sort of obfuscate the clear reality of the facts on hand.
In your book, Ken, you examined the evidence for some very important questions. I'll now ask you about some of them. Here goes. Is there life in space? And if so, what do we know about it?
Is there life in space? Kind of, but it's sort of hard to say. First of all, I'll backtrack a little bit and I'll answer, is there the possibility of life in space? Like, is space a place where life can exist? And the answer to that is a definite yes. When I was a kid, I remember talk about the Earth is very significant and unique as the only place where life could possibly exist. And in fact, it went beyond that, and it was Earth is the only place that has any kind of the stuff we need. It's the only place with water. It's the only place with breathable air. It's the only place that's in the right kind of environment in terms of not too hot, not too cold. It's in this Goldilocks zone. That was kind of a well-known fact when I was a kid, but now that has changed dramatically. We are now seeing that all of these elements that we require to sustain life are actually being discovered pretty much everywhere we look out in space. If you look at water, water is important. The biology that we know, our own bodies are made out of like about 80% water. Water is very important. We would not be able to exist without water. The search for water is kind of an important thing. As it turns out, water is extremely abundant throughout the solar system. It shows up on all the planets and most of the moons in our solar system. Water is everywhere. One of the big surprises was that the asteroid belt, which is a giant pile of rubble in between Mars and Jupiter that was probably once a planet, but somehow got destroyed, really smashed into millions of tiny pieces. A surprising amount of that matter is water on every asteroid and meteor, because these bits of and pieces of space junk, we always used to think it was just rocks, but they keep flying past us. Like, they're always flashing around throughout space because their orbits are stable, but not as stable as a normal planet. So a lot of those bits are often falling out of their normal orbit, and they come sailing past us relatively closely all the time. In fact, we are always being bombarded by rocks, by asteroids and meteorites. They're not like super common, but they're totally not uncommon. And so we've been able to study a lot of these chunks that have landed on Earth. We've also been able, just in the last 10 years, we've been sending out various probes into the asteroid belt and to intercept with other meteors and even comets just in deep space. This has been done by NASA, by the European Space Agency, and by the Japanese Space Agency that I know of. And I'm not aware of other ones, but who knows, I might be missing some stuff there too. But out of those three organizations, all of them have determined and have actually done studies where they were able to intercept these objects and take samples and study what they're made out of. And they all have water in. There's actually more water in the solar system outside of Earth than there is on Earth, and about 50 times more. It might be 500. I might be off by a digit, but it's a lot. There's way more water. If you think there's tons of water on Earth, you ain't seen nothing yet. That was should have been a real paradigm shift, but instead it sort of flew under the radar. Wasn't really ever talked about in like kind of a public forum, even though this is really a game changer. So it's a little bit odd. Water is everywhere. Air is a little bit trickier to talk about because what even is air? Air is just a mixture of a bunch of other stuff. Carbon dioxide and oxygen are the two that we tend to know about because that's the ones that we and the plants breathe and they cycle through. But there's many other gaseous elements such as nitrogen, and there's a lot of different elements that make up what we know as air. And so essentially what it is really just lighter elements that form a gaseous form at certain temperatures. All of those elements exist everywhere we look, whether they happen to be gaseous form or if it's a really cold where they are, they would possibly be in a liquid form, but they're all out there. All of the planets, like literally every single planet in our solar system, has those elements as well as water. water, whether that water might be frozen or in liquid form, depends on the planet, but they all have water and air. Not only that, we are now finding both water and air in exoplanets far away, like light years away, that are orbiting around other stars. It's more difficult to measure those because we have to rely on remote sensing type of data collection instead of, we haven't been able to figure out a way to send a probe somewhere that's light years away. For that, you would need some kind of warp drive. We're a long ways from that. Those planets are out there and they are ready to support life. Whether they may or may not already support life, we have yet to determine. There are some clues. So there are, even in deep space beyond our solar system, as well as various places within our solar system, there have been found, I'm not going to say living creatures, I'm not going to say fossils necessarily, although some of the data indicates a probability or a possibility of fossil remnants of creatures that were once alive. We're starting to get that kind of data, but there's not enough yet to have a conclusive evidence, although I do look at that in the book, and some of the bits of evidence are pretty convincing. But what we are finding without really any controversy is what they call organic compounds, which is the kind of stuff that we're made out of. So the hydrocarbons, proteins, amino acids, all those kinds of things. The farther we get, we're actually finding things in other nebula and galaxies. So nebula are where stars are born. This is very far away. We were once a nebula ourselves, so it's very far away, removed from us in time, as well as the ones that are currently still nebula. Those places are pretty far away in space. But even there, we've been able to, with remote sensing and with some sampling, we have been able to basically determine that there appears to be the elemental carbon chain building blocks of life, which are not DNA itself, but the stuff that DNA is made out of. These have been detected in these stellar nurseries or these nebula. It appears that they are actually being generated within these nebula, which is really interesting because if these stellar nurseries or where stars are born, if those are creating stars but are also creating biological chemicals, then that puts a whole other twist on the quote that Carl Sagan used to like to say, that we are star stuff. He meant that matter was just always cycling through and being destroyed and being reborn in stars, because that's how the birth of a star is really the way that matter is generated in terms of lighter elements like helium and hydrogen, and then eventually they form larger, heavier elements, and thus all matter is made. So that's true. Sagan's observation was true, but now it appears that it might also be true on a whole other scale in terms of literally we are the brothers and sisters of the stars and we're born at the same time in the same place as them. It's fascinating.
As a follow-up to the question, where are the extraterrestrials? Is it possible they already arrived? Could it be that we Earthlings are descendants of those alien beings from outer space?
It's absolutely possible. I don't think anybody can answer the question if it's true or not. I think that there's actually some pretty good indications that is actually the story, because that's the story that our ancestors have been telling and have been handing down to us, that they have been telling for thousands of years, certainly as far back as around 3000 BC. So we're going back 5,000 years now. There's good records from the Sumerian, Babylonian, Assyrian traditions that is in fact the case. So the Sumerian mythology is really centered around these beings that came to Earth. The so-called creation stories in the Sumerian pantheon all refer explicitly to people. I'll call them people, but scholars usually refer to them as the gods. However, there's really nothing divine about them. They don't appear to be immortal or all-knowing or even nice in any of those stories. Rather than projecting our ideas on what we think and kind of creating this false religion around the stories, I have been interpreting the Sumerian stories as truly what I think they truly are, is a history. They are talking about beings that are not human, who existed somewhere else. It's not always clear where they are, although I do talk about some of that in one of my other books, the Enuma Elish, and it seems that these, I'll just call them people for lack of a better word, these people were somewhere else on some other planet, possibly in the galactic core from some hints in the stories. They found their way to Earth and essentially set up Earth as a colony. After a while, they realized that it'd be good to have somebody a little bit smarter than the animals that could actually help them out with some stuff. They created human beings, the Homo sapiens, or we don't know if it's Homo sapiens or if it was an earlier version, such as Neanderthal, perhaps Cro-Magnon man, but it does say that they created these beings to help them, and they were clearly upright walking and with opposable thumb capability to actually do tool use and other kind of more advanced things that animals can't do. It's interesting that that is part of the Sumerian story. It's easy to just write it off as it's a old wives' tale about, we have to explain where we come from somewhere. But the fact of the matter is, we did come from somewhere because we're here. The fact that we exist means that we started to exist at some point. How that exactly happened is up for a lot of speculation. And so we've been speculating for thousands of years, and there are billions of people on Earth today who kind of espouse the idea that somebody made us. Normally that person is referred to as God, and it's usually thought of as a single white man, which is obviously not a really good representation. If there is a God, is he a single white man? I mean, maybe, but there's a lot of guesswork going on here, and I think a lot of projection. Not to say that there's anything necessarily wrong with that assumption, but it's also not really any better than the Sumerian story, in which God is, well, we don't know what color it is because he doesn't mention it, but we do know that he had a wife, and we do know that he had children, and he also had business problems and, the other kinds of things that normal people deal with. Sometimes he got really mad and did things that probably weren't the best decision, which ultimately, if you read any religious literature, their God always is doing that same kind of stuff. And yet he is projected as infallible somehow. Well, it's clear that he's not infallible because read the stories. I'm trying to wade through the stories and find the stories that ring true. And to me, the Sumerian stories have a lot going for them.
Should viewers of Paranormal Yacker want to buy Fermi's Paradox is BS and also learn about the other books you've written, how can they do that?
You can go to my website, which is dimensionfold.com, or you can just go straight to Amazon and search for Fermi's Paradox is bullshit. You actually have to call it the actual word. Unfortunately, I realized after the fact that Amazon won't let me run ads because they have a very moralistic high ground in terms of content that they allowed in ads. I'm sort of having some second thoughts about the title of the book. It is what it is, at least for now. You can search on Amazon or go to my website, dimensionfold.com. If you go there, you'll actually find a lot of other goodies because that will link to my YouTube channel as well as my Substack newsletter, which I'm going to be starting to produce more articles around some of these other topics and questions. And some of it will be snippets from some of my books, and some of it will be probably snippets and questions on other ideas I'm developing or starting to look into.
Ken Goudsward, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yacker. It was great yakking with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. It was great to be here.
Hi, everyone. This is Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yacker. I hope you enjoyed part one of my interview with Ken Goudsward. In part two, I'll be talking with him about the next chapter in the UFO phenomena and the search for connecting and communicating with alien life forms. So that you don't miss it, have access to past interviews, and be amongst the first to receive new interviews when released, be sure to subscribe to my free YouTube channel. To do that, just press the subscribe button on your screen.